everybody. I'm so glad that we have Jonathan Alter today. This is his fourth time here with the Luncheon Society. And each of them have been really fantastic. You know, I think Jimmy Carter is long overdue for presidential reevaluation. You know, the rise to the White House is a stuff of legend. I go back to this book by Jules Whitcover, which is great, a great book as well, that sets up what Jonathan does so well. You know, it was a legendary rise, but when he got there, it seemed that all the bills of the 1960s and 70s came due during the Carter presidency. You had energy, you had inflation, you had kind of that, we'll call it the post-Watergate blues, and of course, the issues of Iran at the end of the administration. But let's not forget, he hired Paul Volcker and Volcker tamed inflation, even though Ronald Reagan got the credit. He brought the first, I guess, architecture for Mideast peace that really will drive that process until it's complete. He got the hostages home. They all came home alive. And his post-presidential activity has really given us a chance to really take a look at his years in the White House, and they're worth looking at again. And I'm so glad I got this. I got the book on Monday. I've been speed reading it, and it's been fun. You know, when you look back at where he came from, my mom's third husband came from Warwick, Georgia, which is about a half an hour out of Plains. And I understand that that's a community, that's a very interesting community when it comes to, in terms of race, in terms of a lot of things back at that time, which Jonathan talks about and puts in clear focus in his book. And so, Jonathan, like we always do, talk for about 10 minutes, and after that, we go right to Q&A. Jonathan, you're up. Okay,
thanks, Bob. Thanks for having me. It's always fun, and thanks to everybody for coming. So I thought I'd just kind of give you a little bit of an overview, maybe tell you how I ended up doing this, just because I think you guys, more than some audiences, are a little bit interested in the backstory. I was kind of looking around for another book to do, and I had just taken a little detour from book writing. I was working on a TV show with Gary Trudeau and trying to figure out what my next project would be. And I had started in on another Jimmy project, a documentary about Jimmy Breslin and Pete Hamill that came out last year on HBO. But I still didn't have a book, and my editor was kind of bugging me. And my editor, who died this year, was the legendary Alice Mayhew of Simon & Schuster, who was one of the great editors. She was, Bob Woodward's editor, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, and Taylor Branch, and a lot of other people. And this was, to be my fourth book with her. And I'm in a book group in New York, and one of the members of the book group knows Jason Carter, Jimmy's grandson, who now runs the Carter Center. And he had run for governor of Georgia in 2014 and lost pretty narrowly. And he arranged to bring Carter to our book group. We were reading Lawrence Wright's 13 Days in September. And I realized after reading that book and talking to Carter that the shorthand on this guy, bad president, great ex-president, that anybody will tell you, it's just become beyond the conventional wisdom, just had to be wrong. There had to be more to this than that. And then when he started talking about human rights and what his human rights policy had done, the after effects of it in the 20 years that followed, helping kick off the democratic revolution around the world, I kind of wanted to find out, first of all, was that true? Because Carter was kind of bragging about it at this dinner. And so I mentioned it to Alice, knowing that Alice was Jimmy Carter's editor, and she was, oh my God, you have to do this. When Alice Mayhew tells you got to do something, you do it. Even though I knew that it was going to be a huge project, because I knew from Bob Caro that, biographies are a whole other thing. And he has this great line in his book that just came out this year called Working, which is a wonderful short book about just what it's like to be Bob Caro, and, not just on not just on Robert Moses, but the great white whale of Lyndon Johnson. And he talks about his first day at the LBJ Library, and there they have this row of windows, and I was there a couple times recently, and you see all of the papers, or a large number of them, and it's just super intimidating because there's millions of them. And they don't have that at the Carter Library, but when I started working, I felt that also, that sort of intimidation of how am I going to, get my arms around this thing. And I wasn't on the Caro plan. He asked me, only one volume, in fact, several times when I'd see him, only one volume. And I'd say, yes, Bob, only one volume. And, I wasn't going to spend 10 or 15 years on Jimmy Carter. 5 years was going to be the outside, but I wasn't sure that I could do it in that amount of time. I decided to work in reverse actuarial order because I knew that they were starting to die off, the people from the Carter administration. So one of the first things I did was to fly to Minnesota and interview Walter Mondale. Fortunately, is still with us. And I interviewed in short order people like Paul Volcker and Zbigniew Brzezinski, both of whom have died, and several others. Harold Brown, the defense secretary, has died since I interviewed him. And I started in just maybe 2 months after I started with my first Jimmy Carter interview, Rosalind Carter. And I was in Plains in my first trip to Atlanta and Plains was in June of 2015. And the reason that I mention that is that one day it was June 16th, and I was sitting in the Carter Library. I had my phone on silent, as you're supposed to do, and I got a text from MSNBC. And Richard Wolff knows, Richard in that period and in a little bit before, he knows what this means. Like they're paging you to go get to a studio so you can yak. And in this case, the subject was Donald Trump is announcing his campaign for president. And so go to the studio in Atlanta. He comes down the elevator. He attacks Mexicans as rapists and the rest. And I was frightened by it, and I realized that we were in the presence of an authentic American demagogue who I knew a little bit from New York. He had threatened to sue me 30 years ago for something I said he wasn't as rich as he claimed to be, and he in a documentary, and he threatened to sue me. So I knew from Trump at that point. And but my real memory, and the reason I mention it, is that I really felt this great sense of comfort and refuge almost going back to the library. And I felt that in all the years since. And it really helped me, especially this year, finish the book, which was that Jimmy Carter was just this great escape for me. It was like a vacation from Trump. And, he is the un-Trump in so many ways. I just got in, speaking of MSNBC, I just got in a little bit of trouble today because, I'm in the middle of my book tour, right? The book just came out. And twice on MSNBC in the last day on 2 different shows, I told a story about when Carter had hemorrhoids in 1978, and his press office was going to put out a statement. He couldn't go to work. It was really painful. The president is indisposed, and they weren't going to say why. And Carter said, "You've got to tell them why. You can't, when it's the president, you have to be transparent." So they put out a statement. He was worried about markets and the global community. And so they put out a statement saying he had hemorrhoids. Anyway, when I talked about it a couple times, I got a word from a third MSNBC show that's going to have me on. Make sure Alter doesn't talk about hemorrhoids anymore. Some of our viewers don't like it. But I actually did not tell them the capper on the story, which was told to me by Jerry Rafshoon, who I think some of you may remember. He was Carter's communications director. And Hamilton Jordan, who I became very friendly with at the end of his life, and Jody Powell are both gone. And I didn't have access. I had, some unpublished things, like Hamilton had a book proposal that was very useful for a book he never wrote, and I had some other things from Jody, but basically of the people in the inner circle, Jerry was my main source. And fortunately, he has this amazing memory. And when I would check his memory against the record, it would check out almost all of the time. So, on top of all these papers I was going through, I had Rafshoon and 250 other people, but Rafshoon I was talking to a lot. So I knew about this story, and I asked Jerry about it, and he said, yeah. And the next day, after Carter acknowledged that he had hemorrhoids in his White House statement, I was on the White House driveway, and Sam Donaldson was 100 feet away with a crew, and he yelled across the driveway, "Jerry, how is the president's asshole today?" And and Jerry gave him the bird, flipped him the bird. So it was just sort of like a reminder now of the difference in transparency. And then another reminder, which still amazes me, is that on the night before the first day of the 1980 Democratic Convention, which was a very ugly convention, Ted Kennedy was contesting it all the way to the end. And Carter did an interview with Dan Rather on 60 Minutes. 60 Minutes was the #1 show, not #1 news show, #1 show in television, with tens of millions of viewers. And Carter had a management consultant who asked everybody to grade their subordinates and themselves. It was the beginning of that whole thing in American business. And so Rather found out about this, and he asked him to grade himself. And Rafshoon had known that this question might be coming, and he told Carter, do not, under any circumstances, grade yourself. Don't answer the question. It's like later that year, they knew that when Carter in rehearsal started talking about having had a discussion about nuclear weapons with Amy, he said, don't tell that story. He did. Same thing happened with Rather. And Rather asks him, grade yourself. So he said, well, on this, I give myself a C, on this a C plus, B minus.
Oh.
And, years later,
Hi, Timmy.
I asked, when I was working on the book, I asked Rather about it, and he was stunned that Carter answered the questions. When I asked Carter about it, he said, well, except for the question on foreign policy, where we didn't quite know yet that Camp David would be so durable, I think my grades would be pretty much the same that I gave in those particular areas. I think he was grading himself too harshly. And my take on him when I was done, and I'll shut up in a second, is that he was, as president, he was a political and stylistic failure, especially in comparison to Reagan on the style side, and the political side, but a substantive and far-sighted success. He signed 14 major pieces of environmental legislation. First fuel economy standards, the first renewable energy, first toxic waste cleanup, protected 100 million acres in Alaska, doubling the size of the National Park Service, helped protect the redwoods in California. They had not been fully protected by Lyndon Johnson, and they were in real danger, and on and on and on. And same thing in many other areas, just in what we're talking about nowadays. People know that he established the departments of energy and education, which I don't actually think are in the top rank of his achievements, but he also created FEMA. He created FISA courts. Trump would never have been impeached if it wasn't for the Ethics in Government Act and the Inspector General Act of 1978. And he got more legislation through for all of his problems with Congress than any president since World War II, except for Lyndon Johnson. And because he had a Democratic Congress for 4 years, and Obama And Clinton only had one for 2. He got more accomplished than they did. If you're looking at just points on the board in a bunch of areas that people didn't care about then and don't care about now. I mean, I asked a really good reporter who had broken the story about Carter being attacked by a killer rabbit, which like dominated the headlines, right? It was read all over the world. A friend of mine, a lot of people, they open their articles with the review of my book in the New York Times this week. It has the killer rabbit thing, I think, in the first or second paragraph. But I asked that guy, do you know what PURPA is? And he said, no, what was PURPA? It didn't even ring a bell. It was the Public Utilities Regulatory Act that first allowed public utilities, incentivized them to use renewable energy. Just maybe a little bit more important than the killer rabbit. So, one of the things I was trying to do was to excavate all of this, but then I also wanted to tell the story of an enormously, I guess, novelistic life, an American epic. He was a barefoot boy who had no electricity, no running water. His family wasn't poor, but Sumter County, Georgia was a very poor and place. And I would use the word backward because it was feudal. And, and then when he came back after serving in Rickover's nuclear navy, which has all kinds of other stories about him running through a melted down nuclear reactor that's almost never been told and not in the depth that I tell it. And, I got his love letters, which are pretty steamy, from the Navy to Rosalind, comes back and he's in the worst of the Jim Crow South after Brown versus Board of Education. And he's silent for 18 years until he becomes governor of Georgia. And I compare that to the silence that we've all experienced in our attitude toward racial injustice in our own time. But he kind of spent the second half of his life making up for what he did and, more important, didn't do in the first half of his life, when he wasn't a racist for reasons I can explain, but he did not stand up, and he ran a dog whistle campaign for governor of Georgia and did some other things that he's not proud of now. But I think that his faith is not the only thing that has powered his achievements. And just very briefly, I only devote maybe 15% of the book to his post-presidency, because while I think his presidency has been underrated, I think his post-presidency has been a little overrated. He didn't have anywhere near the power that he had when he was president. And he also let his ego get in the way some of the time as a former president, and would kind of feud with some of his successors, which I can talk about if you want. So I think I should, Bob, stand down. I've gone more than my 10 minutes, and I'd love to hear any of your thoughts or questions. Sure.
So what we'll do to get into the queue, go to the chat function, just drop your name in. I'll actually start at the first question. And what I want to do is set up the Law speech. I think that we've had some emails that have gone back and forth. The importance of the Law speech, which I've always thought was the most important early Carter speech that he made, and the unique way it came to the public forefront of one of the more unlikely characters within modern American journalism. So walk us through that. And what I didn't realize is that, until I read the book, is that a number of the themes that he was going to talk about were subsumed by somebody else who was speaking that day. So without stealing anybody's thunder, walk us through that and set us up for how that made Carter kind of ready to go national.
So the Law Day speech was in 1974, and Carter had actually decided in late 72, when he'd only been governor for, maybe less than 2 years. And he had gone to the Democratic Convention, nominated Scoop Jackson. It's hard to believe, gave the nominating speech for Scoop Jackson at the convention, tried unsuccessfully to get on the ticket twice after Eagleton cratered. Rosalind Carter made an effort to get Jimmy on as Eagleton's replacement. Of course, it was Sergeant Shriver. And then right after the convention, his aides start thinking he should run for president. And right before the 72 election, he actually makes the decision to run for president. So in 73 and 74 as governor, he's secretly trying to lay the groundwork to run. He's already been sort of unimpressed by the national politicians who've come through Atlanta. And one of them in 1974 was Ted Kennedy. And JFK was one of Carter's idols. And even Rose Kennedy commented at one point that Jimmy Carter looked like her son. But Carter and Kennedy were oil and water from the start for a lot of different reasons that I explore. And I have a lot about the kind of tragedy of them not getting together on health care, because we basically could have had Obamacare in 1979 if Carter had managed his relationship with Kennedy and Kennedy hadn't been so unsupportive of a Democratic president. There was enough blame to go around in that one. And then, of course, he ran against him. But at this point, Kennedy didn't know that Carter was running for president. He just knew that he was this, Southern governor. And he came to Georgia for the Law Day speech that he was delivering at the University of Georgia Law School, because they were dedicating a statue to Dean Rusk, who had been his brother's Secretary of State and had been dean of the law school and was still alive, and had, interestingly, Kennedy didn't know this, he had been the one to urge Jimmy Carter to run for president. And when I asked Carter, what convinced you to run, he said it was when Dean Rusk came by the governor's mansion and told him he should run. So Kennedy is accompanied by Paul Kirk, who I interviewed about this, and Hunter S. Thompson, who later writes a piece in Rolling Stone about showing up drunk at the governor's mansion and them not letting him in. And so then it's time to go to Athens, Georgia, and that's quite a hike from Atlanta. And Kennedy thought that Carter was going to give him a ride in a state plane, and he finds out he didn't. Carter's being really cold to him, which he was pretty much for the rest of Kennedy's life. And so Kennedy has to drive. He's worried he's going to be late. He finally gets there. He delivers what, by all accounts, including Paul Kirk's, is a mediocre speech. But he says a lot of the things that Carter was going to say. So Carter goes in another room, and he's got to deliver remarks at the luncheon that follows. And he scribbles out some thoughts. And he comes out and he delivers this blistering attack on the Georgia legal establishment and the criminal justice system in Georgia. He quotes from Bob Dylan's lyrics, I ain't gonna work Maggie's farm no more, and tells stories that reflect very badly on the elitism of lawyers and how they're not really serving the people of Georgia. Bob made a good point in an email to me that, on one level, it wasn't what a speech should do. You should be trying to get your audience to come around to your point of view. And he was essentially he was insulting his audience. But it had a very, very beneficial outcome for him, because Thompson is sitting in this luncheon and he's bored by the earlier speakers. He keeps going back out to his car, get some wild turkey from his car. He would talk to people back on the way in, attacking Nixon because it was during Watergate, and he's on fire like Hunter Thompson was about Nixon. Goes back out to the car again for more wild turkey. Comes in, and suddenly Carter starts talking, and he goes, "My God, what is this guy saying?" And he goes out to the car a third time, and he gets his tape recorder, and he records this speech, a scratchy recording. And he writes an article about Jimmy Carter in Rolling Stone. And for the next 2 years, he is playing this for any reporter he can find, trying to convince them. Like I saw the other day, I saw my friend Rick Hertzberg, who became Carter's chief speechwriter, and I was his intern actually in the Carter White House in 1978. And he told me something I hadn't known, which is that Thompson told him when he was a reporter for the New Yorker about this Law Day speech. And Thompson was the coolest journalist in America. And every young person, including me, I didn't know him then, of course, but they all revered Hunter Thompson, and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, and just come out. And so when he validated Jimmy Carter, which he did, he never got off Jimmy Carter. He always loved him and thought he was the meanest bastard he'd ever met. He meant it as a compliment, with the exception of Sonny Barger of the Hells Angels. And this and things like the Andy Warhol, depiction of Carter, they made Jimmy Carter cool. And when you're 0% in the polls, getting, Hunter Thompson on your side really can make a difference with those reporters who write stories that can propel you out of nowhere, which is what happened. It was, as Rick Hertzberg said, it was like picking a name out of a phone book, to select a president out of the phone book. But they chose a very smart and capable one.
Okay, so let's go up on next. We have Rusty Schweikert, Richard Wolff, and Fred Barron. So Rusty, you're up. And I think you're on mute. You're on mute, Rusty. There you go. Go ahead, unmute. There you
go. Jonathan, thanks. Great presentation and reminder of Jimmy. My question comes more toward you as an astute advisor or observer of presidents over a significant period of time, which we'll not elaborate more on. But Jimmy and Trump are not exactly opposite, but they're about as opposite as I can imagine. Maybe Obama a little more opposite. But Jimmy was viewed sort of as a scientist by the public. Trump anything but.
Right.
But with your experience and years of watching and studying presidents, they all have roots. You went into the roots of Jimmy Carter to a bit. I'm wondering what your thoughts are now, or your observations in regard to the roots which lead to and have even supported to this day this guy Donald Trump in our society. I mean, he didn't come out of nowhere. And I wonder if you could reflect a bit on what you see having happened to the society and where it might be going in the future that led to a Trump, and might, even after Trump loses, if he does, hopefully, that will persist beyond him.
It's a great, really complicated question. I agree the roots go way back. So where, as I've been saying, when I asked Carter, do you have anything in common with Donald Trump? And I asked him by email, because I had said, you were both outsiders. You came to the presidency from, way outside the system. Do you have anything in common with Donald Trump? And at this point, I was writing emails to him. It was after our in-person interviews were over, and he would always respond within an hour to my, 10 questions. And he just gave me a one-word answer, no. But actually, they do, and they shared an advisor named Pat Cadell, who I think many of you know about. And Pat was a prodigy pollster. He was a pollster when he was in high school, and by the time he was at Harvard, he was a professional pollster, and he was George McGovern's pollster when he actually didn't have his degree yet from Harvard, but he was like 23 years old, pollster for the nominee for president. And Hamilton Jordan and Jody Powell and Jerry Rafshoon got a meeting with him at the 72 convention. And then later, Carter hired Cadell as his pollster, and he was the guy behind the malaise speech, where Carter never used the word malaise, but he was not as influential as a number of journalists have said with Carter, because Carter actually, until he got close to an election, He didn't care that much about polls, but he did recognize in Carter this outsider quality. Then later, he went to work for Joe Biden, again, trying to get him to run as an outsider. He worked for him when he was elected in actually the same year he worked for McGovern. He worked for Biden, helping get Biden get elected to the Senate as an outsider. He ran, he was a nobody, and he won that primary by running against Caleb Boggs, I think was the name, against Washington, right? That was Cadell's big thing. He later worked for Ross Perot against Washington. So in the summer of 2016, Pat died like a year and a half ago, I'd say. In 2016, I had dinner with Pat, and all I wanted to do was talk to him about Carter because I didn't know when I would get him again. It was a very odd dinner in New York because Pat, when he was in his 20s, was gray. He had a famous gray streak to his beard. But now, at the end of his life, he had shoe polish on his hair, on his beard, and it was really odd. Jet black. He wanted to talk to me about Trump because he was working for Trump. So he had made the journey from George McGovern, Jimmy Carter,
wow,
Joe Biden, Gary Hart, Ross Perot, Donald Trump. What do they all have in common? Outsiders. And I think Trump is kind of the perversion of that. It took the outsider appeal and turned it into a fuck you appeal. He won among people who just said, fuck you to the liberals, fuck you to Washington, fuck you to the old line Republicans, fuck you to all of them. And there is that vote. And then there's also, there is racism. So basically in 1976, and I think racism is no small part of this, and misogyny, but, against Hillary, but a large dollop of racism. So to me, one of the most important achievements of Jimmy Carter, which could never be recognized at the time, although there was a fair amount of commentary about it, and it set him on the course to getting the Democratic nomination, is that in the Florida primary in 1972, and Cadell was from Florida, so he was a genius at kind of tailoring Carter's message. Carter whipped George Wallace. And that was the end of Wallace's political career in the winter, late winter of 1976. And from that point forward, the Democratic Party has not had a racist wing. And it was a racist political party since the 1790s. And suddenly there is no racist wing in the Democratic Party. So where do all of those racists go? They go into the Republican Party. And Trump has been very skillful in consolidating that base. I think ultimately it was the wrong play politically, because I don't think a base consolidation strategy is going to get him over the hump. But you have to give him, points for doubling down and doubling down again and again and again on that fuck you vote. And they're very loyal to him. It's the Fifth Avenue crowd. He could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and they'd still be with him.
You think it's going to persist?
That's a really hard question to answer. I think it will. It depends on the margin. Everything depends on the margin. So I'm terribly afraid of a close election because, this guy is the first president in American history who won't guarantee a peaceful transfer of power. That started with George Washington. And, so they have done all kinds of things to suppress the vote. They have like 200 lawsuits out there. Trump has said up front that, he's appointing Barrett and Part so that she can rule in his favor. They're not Republicans, they're banana Republicans. And that's the scary thing. But if he gets his butt kicked, and today anyway, and this can change, today it looks like he might get his butt kicked, then he's a loser. And Trump's whole thing is, I'm a winner, And if he's a loser, and then he'll still have his remnants and they'll always be there. And they'll go to his grave like people would go to, Mussolini or Hitler's graves if they existed. It's one of the reasons why they don't exist. And his library will be in Mar-a-Lago or wherever it is, will be very well attended. but I don't really see his tweets meaning very much next year. And I think Democrats will have the good sense to go, who gives a shit what Donald Trump thinks anymore? And meanwhile, he's in serious legal jeopardy. I mean, the former IG at the Department of Justice, after his taxes came out, said there's mail fraud, wire fraud all over these tax
It
returns.
says you're using the computing. So now I guess we changed it to that automatic setting.
In any event, I think he's got, if his health survives, he's got real problems.
So I'm seeing the image, but I'm not hearing anything. Right.
Thanks, John.
Additional something there. Looking through to see what I think we're okay. I don't know where that noise was coming from, but we're okay. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude. Carry on.
Should we? Are we good, Rusty, or do you want me to go on?
No. I guess the only thing I mean, other people need to get in here, but as a quick response, do you see, even in the case of an overwhelming, the 8 or 10% current poll thing, do you see as a result of that big a loss violence?
Well, I think there will be some violence at various polling places in November. I don't know how widespread it will be, but he's trained about 30,000 poll watchers, and these are hardcore. These are vote suppressors. And so what's going to happen is in some of these precincts, people are going to come in and, their driver's license will say, like mine, Jonathan H. Alter. And in the voter registration, it'll say Jonathan Alter. And that Trump trained guy is going to say, you have to take a provisional ballot. You can't vote. They didn't match. And somebody else will say, well, no, I think he can still vote. No, he can't vote. And then some voters will go, you're going to have to throw me out of here. You're not going to stop me from voting, and it's going to get, I predict it's going to get pretty hot in some areas, but I don't think that I don't think the Proud Boys are going to, start attacking polling places. Now, with Trump, every time you think he's touched bottom, he crashes through the floor. So you could see a situation where he riles them up after the election. If he loses and he knows that, he could end up in jail, he may go full banana republic and, tell the Proud Boys and their like to take to the streets. So I don't rule that out.
Thanks for your comments, John.
Okay, we'll move on to Richard Wolf, Father Mike Risso, John Ahrensmeyer, and Tim Farley. Richard, you're up, and it's good to see you again.
Thank you. Good to be with you, John. Congratulations. Every book's a monumental achievement, and this is a very important work, so well done.
Thanks.
They say that history is written by the victors, and even though that's a cliche that our Newsweek editors would have immediately deleted, I'm going to say it anyway. The Reagan folks clearly had an interest in suggesting that Carter was a dismal failure, but it always struck me that the Clinton folks did that too.
Yes.
And so how much of Carter's reputation do you think was actually shaped by the narrative laid down by another Southern Democratic governor who turned president?
Well, first of all, I think it's a cliche, but it's an important one. It reminds me of when Nixon came to Newsweek in 1988, and I had arranged the visit, it was on my bucket list of things to meet Nixon. So I went through all sorts of arrangements to bring him to Newsweek. And it was the Washington Post company, of course, that had taken him down. But we ran this cover my mother never forgave called Nixon's Back. He's Back, with a picture of Nixon. So I asked Nixon, I said, how will history regard Ronald Reagan, who was getting set to leave office? And he said, well, you have to distinguish between history and the historians, because the historians are like you, they're liberals, If you're a conservative, you go into business. If you're a liberal, you go into journalism or history writing, And then he went on to say that if the deficit was not fixed, that Reagan would be remembered as a bad president because he bankrupted the country. If it was fixed, he'd be remembered as a very good president. And that was actually pretty acute assessment. So I think your assessment, Richard, of what happened to Carter is spot on. And the fraught relationship between Carter and Bill Clinton is a pretty big part of my book. Interestingly, George H.W. Bush, obviously Jimmy Carter, and Barack Obama all gave me interviews. Bill Clinton spoke to me off the record. Let me leave it at that. And when I asked Carter on the record, what he thought of Clinton, he was pretty critical. And then, when Clinton and Obama were basically attacked by Carter in a Maureen Dowd column 3 years ago, it caused all that bad blood to come up again. But you're right that Clinton, even though he took a number of people from the Carter administration, like Warren Christopher would be the most memorable example, but several others, he didn't even ever really like to admit it. And all of them didn't really want Carter to show up at their conventions. He would embarrass them because the stench of failure. And also he was too close to the Palestinians, or at one point he had just met with Hamas before the 2008 convention. Being followed by Reagan, like Truman, who left office less popular than Carter, he wasn't really rehabilitated until David McCullough's book in the 80s. But even, Truman had a better hand dealt to him because, he was followed by Eisenhower, and the Democrats never deserted him the way they did Jimmy Carter. I think it is now changing. I mean, Buttigieg, Booker, and Klobuchar all made pilgrimages to Plains. So I think, and Stu Eisenstadt came out with a book about it's not a biography, but, his old aide came out with a policy-heavy book a year or so ago that, is a good book and began that revisionism. And then Kai Bird is coming out with a book next year about Carter. There's 3 documentaries. One of them, Rock and Roll President, I think will get a lot of viewing. Barbara Koppel did one on the Iran hostage rescue mission. So I do think that the Carter revival is kind of here. Some people who love Carter won't necessarily love my book because it's very much warts and all, and I don't think he's quite ready for Mount Rushmore.
And with that, we move on to Father Mike Russo. And thanks for everybody to keeping these to one-part questions. Father Mike, you're up.
Mike's gone. Mike had to go.
Oh, he's got to go. Then we go to John Ernstmeyer, you're up. I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Jonathan, for writing this book. I've been saying what this book says for years to anybody who'll listen. I worked for Carter as I was a college student in Philadelphia in the fall of '76. I barely went to class. I did so much work for him. It was a swing state then, still is today.
Yeah.
And I thought he just got an incredibly raw deal. I did recognize that, in terms of personal relations and schmoozing people, that was clearly not his strength. But I've kind of been amazed over the years that he continues to get a raw deal about his presidency, not his post-presidency. And I just, I guess I'm stating the obvious, that it just seems like it's this triumph of style over substance. And you see that bad and good. You see that with Trump as well. And it seems that is what, no offense here, journalists and others really seem to care about and focus on more. I mean, Reagan's a perfect example of that. And, you've listed all these incredible things that Carter accomplished despite the hand he was dealt. And yet he's still considered by the mainstream, maybe your book will change that, as a failed president. So I don't know if it's just style or something else, but I kind of love your perspective on that.
I think a lot of it is style, especially compared to Reagan. And, he just wasn't a good communicator. His eyes would bulge out. He would emphasize the wrong words. He wasn't a good politician. Rosalind was this fascinating figure to me. And she gave me her unpublished journals and the really explicit love letters that Jimmy wrote her, she was the politician in the family, and she would always be telling him, do this in a second term. Don't do this now. You're just hurting yourself. And he was, well, look, the politics will take care of themselves. If somebody brought up the politics with him, they would get the icy blues. He would stare at them. He only would focus on it in 1980, and then he would have other people do the political work for him. He just wasn't cut out for that. But you do have to be a good politician to be a well-regarded president. And he was lacking in some of those political skills. And, his biggest regret, which we discussed quite a bit, was that he just didn't do more within the Democratic Party. It's really hard to go into an election year with a divided party. And he admits that he didn't handle that right. But the achievements just go on, and there's a tragic dimension to it too. This was something I didn't learn until I was well into my research. There was something called the Council on Environmental Quality, the CEQ. It was run by a guy named Gus Speth, who was his top White House advisor on the environment. And Carter was a planner from his days in Southwest Georgia. He had started these planning commissions, always planning everything, established FEMA and
Good work.
new continuity of government initiatives, all kinds of other things. So for instance, if 3 Mile Island had gone badly, they, unlike COVID, they had a whole plan for what to do. And he started this, he commissioned this thing called Global 2000, which was to be about sustainability and where would we be on critical issues in the year 2000. And so Gus Speth was head of this process, and he issued several reports, and Carter either introduced legislation, which usually passed, or issued executive orders that related to recommendations out of Global 2000. At the end of 1980, early 1981, Speth releases 2 reports on what was then called carbon pollution, or in a couple of examples, global warming, not climate change yet. And Carter would have taken action on global warming in the early 1980s had he won that election. And to me, that really changes the stakes of 1980 for the historical, in the long view of history. And he had already, introduced fuel economy standards and these other things, and wanted hybrids and 48 miles per gallon by the end of the 80s. So he was very forward thinking on the environment. And, my book opens with him putting up solar panels on the roof of the White House. He was laughed at, ridiculed. Reagan took them down. And that gives you some idea of his, farsightedness. So political failure, farsighted success is my shorthand.
Okay, next up is Tim Farley, Paul Costello, and the godmother of us all, Martha Whetstone.
Hey, Mr. Alter, I really appreciate you doing this. I'm a big fan of your work. I've got your Franklin Roosevelt book back there, and
Excellent.
I like that. I was a young Carter delegate in 1980, and I was actually at the midterm in 78, where there's a bunch of Carter and Kennedy animosity going back then. I'm reminded of the book that you mentioned by Merrill Muller on plain speaking. They were talking about Truman trying to get renominated. And the quote that Truman said, "Any shithead on this side of the desk can get renominated." So what was Ted Kennedy thinking, truly, in 1980 that he could defeat a sitting president? And do you think Kennedy ever regretted that running?
It's such an interesting story. So first of all, there were a lot of knuckleheads, myself included. So I mentioned I had been an intern for Jim Fallows and Rick Hertzberg in the Carter speechwriting office in 1978. By 1980, I was out of college, and I volunteered briefly for Ted Kennedy. He was the cool guy. Anybody cool in the Democratic Party was Kennedy. And he was the by today's standards, he was the progressive. All the Bernie people would have been for Ted Kennedy, right? Because Carter believed in things like balanced budgets, and he cut some things, he cut some programs, although he didn't really that much, and he got a lot of liberal programs enacted. But in any event, I think that it just became so bitter. And I remember in 2002, I spent the day with Kennedy. I was doing a piece for the Today Show about his 50th anniversary, 40th anniversary in the Senate. And he was very generous with his time. And I wasn't working on the Carter book then, but I remember asking him, do you regret any earlier opportunities when you could have gotten healthcare done with Nixon and Carter in particular, and Clinton, Nixon, Carter, Clinton. So he talked about how much he regretted not getting a deal done with Nixon. And of course, his regrets over Hillary care not going through, just skipped right over Carter. And I don't know if that's because he felt guilty about rejecting what turned out to be a very doable Carter plan, even though it was very tardy and not what Kennedy wanted. Kennedy did not want single payer, by the way. This really surprised me. He thought single payer was not achievable, but he wanted a more aggressive bill. In any event, the bad blood just kept getting worse. And I think Kennedy just felt Carter despised him. And in his memoirs, he's pretty hard on Carter and just says that the chilliness that a lot of people noticed was directed more his way. Carter in recent years has been trying to be more charitable to Kennedy and says that he's glad that he got Steve Breyer appointed to the federal bench after he lost, which was a favor to Kennedy. And I think he wishes he had done the same thing for Archibald Cox. That started their bad blood. Kennedy wanted Archibald Cox to be a federal judge, and Carter wouldn't do it, in part because it was petty. Cox had cut an ad for Mo Udall during the primaries, and he thought he was too old. But he had his reasons. But it was a dumb thing of Carter to do that got him off on the wrong foot with Kennedy. But Kennedy should have never challenged him. His brother-in-law, Steve Smith, told him to drop out. I think that Hamilton Jordan's view was, fine, challenge us, but when you lose, drop out. And instead, he hung in there. He hung in through New York, and then he won the New York primary, and then it was going to go all the way to the convention, and it got really bitter.
And with that, one thing I've noticed that Carter has the benefit of outliving his rivals.
Yes, that helps.
And that reminds me of certain respects, the Ted Sorensen book because we were with him in 2009, which that was a lot of fun. And I walked him to the restaurant where we were in New York, but he had the benefit of outliving. I think at that time, perhaps one of the few people who were still alive was maybe Dick Goodwin and perhaps Senator Kennedy himself. So we move on.
Ted Sorensen story, just very quickly, Bob, there's a Ted Sorensen story in my book because he was Carter's choice to be CIA director, and then he had to withdraw the nomination. And Rosalind told me in the last few years that was a bad move on Carter's part, even though Biden was among those bailing, Biden, Mondale, they were bailing on the Sorensen nomination. But Rosalind said we should have stuck with it early on because we sent them a signal that we could get rolled by withdrawing that nomination.
One thing I never, before we go to the next question, let's talk about this for a second. I always thought the Sorensen position, and maybe Andy and Steve can chime in on that, at CIA was a mistake. He should have been at Justice. There you would have a stronger case.
Yes.
You would have had a Kennedy. It would have been Bobby Kennedy Jr. And that sounds trite, but you would have had somebody who had that credibility, and
Absolutely.
maybe throw Griffin Bell to CIA because he ended up doing stuff in the Reagan administration anyways.
Right. And actually, Carter ended up not liking Griffin Bell, even though he was from Georgia. They didn't get along all that well. No, that would have definitely been that's what Sorensen wanted, and that's what they should have done. And that I think if I had pressed Carter, I think he probably would have admitted that would have been the better thing.
One of the things that can I just jump in here for a second? One of the reasons that Sorensen had the problem on the CIA is he'd been a conscientious objector during the Second World War,
Right.
And that's what was held against him over that post.
Yeah, there was that, and then and there were some bogus charges too, that he had taken some classified papers home when he was writing the book Kennedy, his memoir of the Kennedy administration. But yeah, the conscientious objector stuff really hurt him for that particular post. And if they'd done a better job during the transition, they wouldn't have made that mistake. They made some mistakes early on, but they also had a lot of, there was a kind of no good deed goes unpunished quality to it too. So very early in the presidency, on his first day, he pardons draft dodgers. And, the conservatives go crazy. Barry Goldwater says, the worst thing anybody has ever done in all my years in the Senate. But meanwhile, on the left, they're going, well, why didn't you pardon the deserters? The draft dodgers who went to Canada were more middle class. So he couldn't catch a break. And I think that Jody Powell was correct when he said, we not only didn't get a honeymoon, we didn't even get a one-night stand, with the press. Because the post-Watergate press that had helped make him president, he had really gotten like a free ride for most of 1976. Once he becomes president, they are determined to prove that he's just like Nixon. And I go after Woodward a little bit in the book, because they were assuming that Jimmy Carter was Nixon, and he wasn't, and meanwhile, the left of the party was happy to see the press rip Carter apart because they were ready for Teddy.
And with that, we move on to Paul Costello, and then Martha Whetstone, and Vincent after that, and then Larry Berman.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hi,
Good to
Paul.
see you. Good to see you.
I remember doing some work with you, right, at the end of the Carter administration.
Yes, right. You're right. So, I wanted to, as you know, I was on Rosalind's staff for 4 years, and no one really understands the power and the influence of Rosalind. And I'm sure that she probably shared with you her diaries from Camp David and the vitriol that went on between Sadat and Begin. Can you talk a little about the behind the scenes at Camp David and what unfolded, and also her power and influence and partnership with the president?
I mean, she was his most important advisor. At one point, Hugh Sidey wrote a column where he heard that Carter had assembled his advisors, and he said, get Rosalind, size, big, ham, and Hugh Sidey wrote, note the order. But she was a smart advisor and widely respected. I never found a single person who had anything critical to say about her. She's such a formidable person, an accomplished person in her own right, on mental health and many other issues. Camp David, I mean, when I got, at first, when I got the love letters, I was, whoa, I can't believe she gave these to me. When I got her diaries from Camp David and the intensity of what went on there, Carter had to separate after the second day. It was 13 days at Camp David. He had to separate Sadat and Begin after day 2. And the only time they saw each other from then until the end of the conference was when they all went to Gettysburg, and Begin recited the Gettysburg Address from heart, by heart. And it almost fell apart over and over again. They packed their bags to leave over and over again. And it was just Carter's determination. And he would come back and he would vent to Rosalind, usually about Begin, but sometimes about Sadat. And she would write it all down. And so while his diaries are also very useful because they're from Camp David and other places, because they're pretty candid also, and they give you a good sense of what was going on. Hers give you the the grit. And the same thing, she didn't keep diaries every day like Jimmy did, but when the hostages almost came home in March of 1980, she is keeping a journal every day then, and then that falls apart. That's when they do the hostage rescue mission, and on a couple of other occasions. And you're really getting a completely fresh, very up close view of what was going on with them in that period from these journals. And you know, a lot of the other part is that nobody remembers, and where her journals are also really helpful, is that Camp David fell apart in late 1979. Begin backed out basically, and it was a handshake that wasn't a treaty at Camp David. It was they called them accords, and they agreed to a certain set of steps that they would do before signing the treaty. And so 6 months later, Carter had to go to Jerusalem and Cairo and put the whole thing back together again. Cairo went great. Sadat gave him his proxy, but in Jerusalem, Carter had a lot of problems with Begin. And, you know, she's very honest about all of that. And at one point she sympathizes with him because they see him in the Knesset and they realize that, you know, Sadat is in an authoritarian state. What he says goes. Begin has to deal with these Knesset members who are screaming at him. And so Carter, with Hamilton Jordan's help, gets involved in Israeli politics and arranges to address the Israeli cabinet. And he's already established really good relationships with Ezer Weitzman and Moshe Dayan at Camp David that he was then able to draw on in the crunch. But again, he almost came home empty-handed, and he went there at great personal risk. Everybody's telling him, don't shine a light on the fact that Camp David failed. Don't go back to the region. Are you crazy? Like, everybody's telling him this. So he's a guy, he was the inverse of Bill Clinton, who was, you know, personally reckless and politically really cautious. Carter was personally, obviously, you know, completely, you know, faithful and not a lot there personally in terms of risk taking. But politically, he was a huge risk taker in several areas. Panama Canal, we haven't talked about at all. 2/3 of the country's against it. Ronald Reagan's making his career on it. It requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate. 2/3 against requires 2/3 vote. The heaviest of heavy lists cost 5 senators their seats. Prevented a war in Central America, according to all the chiefs. 100,000 troops minimum would have had to be sent, and they'd probably still be there fighting a rear guard guerrilla war. Reagan, of course, didn't do anything to repeal them when he came into office. So there's just all of these things that felt kind of musty and, you know, are they that interesting? And when I started Panama Canal, is that really that interesting? But when you get into it, there are these fascinating stories behind them, and there's an intensity to Carter. I asked Jeff, his son, one of his sons, you know, what word would you use to describe him? Intense, difficult guy, prickly, steely, not at all what you see with the cardigan sweater, you know? And this is one reason why a lot of Democrats didn't like him, because he could be cold and not nearly as likable as Ted Kennedy. But all of that is part of this complexity that really fascinated me.
And with that, we move on to Martha Whetstone, Vincent, and Steve Schlesinger. One thing before I jump on, if I don't just a 2-second thing, wasn't didn't John Wayne favor the Panama Canal Treaty? And that was the outlier within the conservative community.
Yes, and that his support was extremely important. And one of Carter's aides wrote a bunch of op-ed pieces that John Wayne put out under his name, and I use correspondence between John Wayne and Ronald Reagan, where John Wayne writes him these really, really sharply worded letters. He'd known Reagan for years, and it was like basically saying, you've got your head up your ass about this. You don't know what you're talking about. And Wayne had been married to a Panamanian woman, and he had invested in Panama. He knew the issues down there. And he was Jimmy Carter was one of the last people he saw before he died. And even though he'd been a Republican his whole life, he loved Jimmy Carter.
And with that, we go to Martha Whetstone.
Hi, I worked for Bill Clinton, and during the time of the Clinton presidency, we would do trips, and Bill Clinton's photographer, Bob McNeely, had also worked as a photographer for Jimmy Carter. And part of, our fun was have McNeely sit at the back of the plane and tell us Jimmy Carter stories. And it seemed like he had probably 1,000 stories, and they had the same theme of what a micromanager he was. Including, taking on the White House gardener and saying that since he was a farmer, he knew better how to do the White House grounds, and how the gardener had to manipulate around Carter. And, but he would have, just scores and scores of the most incredibly unbelievable stories. And so I wondered whether or not you found that to be true in your research and in talking to people about Carter, because some of the stories are just, frankly, for a president, unbelievable that he would get involved in some of the stories that, some of the detail of the minutia.
Right. So the most famous example that my old boss from when I worked for Carter wrote about in the Atlantic was that he kept the White House tennis court logs, of who got to play. It turned out not to be true. And a lot of the things that people thought he was personally doing like that was actually done by Susan Clow, his secretary, who forged his signature and his initials on a lot of things. He was more of a micromanager in Georgia. I dealt with this a fair amount for a couple of reasons. It's been so enduring as a critique of Carter. And at a certain point, I realized, is it really that bad? Instead of playing golf, he's reading scientific journals and, designing Amy Carter's treehouse. He didn't actually build it, but, or the gardens. My favorite story about flowers is Carter was incredibly, ridiculously cheap throughout his life. To this day, he's super, super cheap. And he found that even though he wasn't paying for them, what the White House staff was paying for the centerpieces for state dinners was appalling to him. And so and he made it clear that he thought it was absolutely appalling. So the White House, the person in charge, sent one of his staffers out into Rock Creek Park to pick wildflowers there. And that person was arrested for picking wildflowers for the president's centerpiece. But some of it was ridiculous. And I'm sure that McNeely's stories, most of them are true. But, people's good qualities are often the flip side of their bad qualities. And if you take Camp David, the Panama Canal treaties, where he's read all the treaties way down into the history of Panama, the Alaska Lands Bill, where he knew more about it than the Alaska delegation, about, how to draw the map so they actually protected wildlife and wilderness areas. They were going to try to pull the wool over his eyes by letting development in all these areas. Everything that he accomplished was in part a product of that attention to detail. And especially now when the president doesn't even read or listen to intelligence briefings, it's kind of refreshing to think of a president he is an engineer. And, the thing about it, the reason, so my line on Carter is that he was a visionary without being a genuine leader, an authentic, natural leader. Because engineers are very infrequently good leaders. They don't get to be CEO because they're so rational and they're so focused on the details and, what is the right answer. And they think they can get to the right answer if they study the problem enough. And other people are going, well, what about the politics? What about this? And the engineer, so I have a chapter called His Inner Engineer, they are focused on the details, like how do we make this work? How do we make this better? And that was Carter. He was always trying to make it better. And a lot, sometimes he would fail. Some of his biggest failures were when he wasn't paying enough attention. So he didn't pay enough attention to the Iranian Revolution. At one point, they're having a cabinet meeting. Most of it's about Bella Abzug, who he fired, justifiably, by the way, the same week as the Shah is leaving Iran. And the whole meeting is about Bella Abzug, not the Shah, abdicating or fleeing. And then he got hoodwinked by Rockefeller's people, and he let the Shah in for medical treatment, even though just a couple months earlier, when they were hassling him about letting the Shah in before they knew he was sick, Carter actually said, "Fuck the Shah." Harold Brown told me, I couldn't believe he said "fuck the Shah," but he did. But then what happened was the Rockefeller people fooled Carter into thinking that Mexico couldn't treat him, that they didn't have good facilities there, and he had to come to the US. And when he let him in for treatment on a humanitarian basis, then they seized the hostages right after that. So, it was when he wasn't, the few times when he wasn't paying enough attention that it hurt him.
So we'll move on to Vincent, Steve Schlesinger, and Larry Berman. I'm going to be mindful, it's 1:23 now. Can we go, as they say, into a few minutes of extra time, as they say in soccer, or is your schedule that?
No, it's okay. We can go.
Okay, good. We've got a great group. Vincent, you're up. And you may be on mute.
Let me just double check this.
You're on mute, Vincent.
Jonathan, thank you very much for your service as a historian. I've read all your books and I'm on these calls often. I was in New Hampshire in February of 1980.
Mm-hmm.
You were probably there too.
No, I wasn't.
And I'm glad you're bringing this up. The hatred of Ted Kennedy's supporters against Carter never ended after the speech in New York. There are many, many diehard Kennedy supporters who went back to being Bobby Kennedy supporters, who got involved in politics because of President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, who hated Carter so much. They were working with the Reagan campaign because they believed, as you know, the story has come out, that the third book of the debate was taken by a Kennedy person because these diehard Kennedy people were working with the Reagan people in opposition research, and they believed that Reagan was a dunce and that Reagan would not, even if he got elected, Ted could run against him in '84. Right.
Yeah, well, Paul Corbin, who was a, kind of a Bobby Kennedy operative who was quite an unsavory character. He was responsible. He eventually confessed to being responsible for filching the debate briefing book and giving it to Reagan. I don't know if that was decisive in that election, but it's a great point, and it does reflect on the level of bitterness. I interviewed several Kennedy people, but in some ways the most interesting was with Steve Smith Jr., whose father was JFK and Teddy's brother-in-law and was the campaign chairman. And he's my age. He was a classmate of mine. He was just out of college, and his father let him sit in on pretty much all of the meetings. And he thought that Teddy, even then, he was off kilter. His heart wasn't in it, and he really should have been running, and that he was very insecure, basically. And he was a very flat candidate. I mean, he was way ahead in the polls. Then the Roger Mudd interview, which I deal with the same day as the hostages are seized, Roger Mudd interview airs, and then Kennedy just craters, in part because he was a bad candidate. I mean, this was in the period when I was doing some work for him, and he was just not a good candidate. But what I hadn't known until talking to Steve is that I had heard it from one person, that Steve confirmed it, that his father really wanted him to get out after New Hampshire, or maybe one more primary after that. And I think Carter would have had a much better chance if Kennedy had taken Steve Smith's advice.
I mean, so you were there that night in February of '80 when he lost New Hampshire. The Kennedy people were so shocked. I mean, I saw men and women crying. They could not believe they lost the New Hampshire primary.
Yeah, to a Georgian. It is pretty amazing in retrospect.
Thank you so much for this book.
Thank you.
Well, before we go to Larry Berman, the one question is a 2-second question, a 2-second answer. Running for office in 1968 is different than running for office in 1980. The Carter people had the benefit of the post-McGovern rules, something that perhaps the Kennedy people didn't have or didn't import in terms of the senior management. Did that have some aspect to Ted Kennedy's failure to catch fire early in the primaries?
No, I don't think so. They just got, the rules were really important for Carter in 76. In 80, Carter he had a better campaign, even though he was way behind in the polls. Hamilton Jordan wasn't worried. They had Florida wired, and they always had good connections in New Hampshire. Gene Shaheen was early Carter. So I don't think it was the rules. But then, a number of things happened before the New York primary, and that really set Carter back. And then they challenged his nomination they challenged the robot rule, which required you to vote for the candidate you were pledged to. And if things had gone a little differently at the convention, Kennedy had some very good organizers, and he came a little too close for comfort for the Carter people to actually upending that whole convention and having an open convention. Then, there's the famous moment at the end of the convention when Kennedy kind of takes his own sweet time coming over from the Waldorf, comes on stage and won't give Carter the money shot, that they need for the news magazines of the two hands up there. And Kennedy writes about it in his memoirs. And I asked Carter about it. And when I asked Carter, and this gives you a sense of the bitterness between them, I said, what were you thinking when Kennedy came on stage and gave you that very perfunctory handshake? And he said that he was drunk.
Wow. Steve Schlesinger, Larry Berman, Nancy Iverson. And I think we're going to be mindful of your time. We're going to extra innings, and Jonathan, we appreciate your patience with all
Sure.
that.
Hi, John. My question is a little offbeat, but how much does religion play in Carter's life? I mean, he's still teaching Sunday school in his 90s, and he obviously has a religious thing to his whole candidacy from the very beginning. Yet it's not really talked about very much in terms of his either as a president or as his source of values and so on, as a candidate and as a president.
Well, it's everything. I mean, it is authentic. And when he was president, he prayed as often as 30 times a day, sometimes just to do his best, which was one of maybe 10 reasons I called the book his very best. But he was taught about faith by an illiterate Black woman farmhand named Rachel Clark. And he had a spiritual crisis after he lost for governor the first time. The born again experience is more complicated than myth had it. It wasn't just his sister, getting him to be born again. It was affected by his going door to door as a missionary in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts in 1968, when everybody else was focused on 68. He was focused on his own spiritual development. At one point, they went into a brothel and they tried to convert the madam. And he was very serious in his study of theology. Reinhold Niebuhr, Sad Duty of Politics is to Do Justice in a Sinful World, was a very important idea for him. And but he is what I call an original Baptist. He's since left the Southern Baptist Convention, the main organization of white Baptists, because of their treatment of women. And and a number of other issues. The original Baptists, the Roger Williams Baptists, were strong believers in the separation of church and state. And Carter always observed that. He would not have prayer breakfasts at the White House. If he would have his cabinet pray, it was non-denominational, no clergy. Billy Graham went there once, in part because he was bitter at Graham for attacking him during the Lust in My Heart episode, because Graham and Oral Roberts knew perfectly well that every Baptist boy of a certain generation learned when they were like 10 or 11 years old that they would be lusting in their heart. So there's a great story of, after he becomes president, Oral Roberts, who's piled on. The Playboy interview took place in the September of 76, and Carter lost 10 points in the polls. It was a huge deal. And all these hypocrites are piling on. Carter's son goes on the radio and attacks them for being hypocrites. And so Oral Roberts is one of the people attacking him. Then after he wins, Oral Roberts contacts Ruth Carter Stapleton, Jimmy's sister, who's a kind of a new age evangelist, combining psychology with religion, and became very popular. And she says, would the president come and do the convocation at Oral Roberts University? We'd be so honored to have him. And so Carter tells his sister, oh, you tell Oral, I am just so honored that he would consider me for that very important role, delivering the convocation address at Oral Roberts, but I couldn't possibly accept because, I did lust in my heart. And which is just such a great job at Oral Roberts. And so he always has had his religion in perspective. And I went to Sunday school. He's unfortunately not healthy enough to do it anymore with COVID, but his Sunday school lessons were so, even if you were Jew like me, they were so moving and so moral and reflective of what Rick Hertzberg called his moral ideology. He really didn't have a political ideology other than sort of turn of the century progressivism, but this is what really hurt him. He would be liberal on some issues, conservative on other issues, and people couldn't get a fix on him in the Democratic Party. But he always had this moral ideology, and we haven't talked about human rights. After he left office, Carl Deutsch, who was one of the great international relations experts, Harvard professor, was down at Emory, and he ran into Carter on the path. Carter was kind of dejected. He had just lost. And Deutsch said, 1,000 years from now, they'll remember very few American presidents, and you will be one of them because you set a new global standard for how governments treat their people. And even though it was hypocritical with the Shah and Marcos, it was the middle of the Cold War, Carter himself was disappointed in his human rights policy. It did change the world. If you talk to people like Václav Havel and others, and even conservatives who say that it had a lot to do, the soft power of that had a lot to do with hollowing out the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War more peacefully. So,
Argentina.
Well, he did really important work in Argentina. The human rights policy was hugely effective in Chile and Argentina. And if you read books by like Jacobo Timmerman and people like that. And to this day, people who are imprisoned in South America come to the Carter Center and tell their story and how, important it was when they were in prison that Carter had this policy. And when John was inaugurated as president of South Korea, he told Patricia Darien, who had been Carter's assistant secretary, the first assistant secretary for human rights, that he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for Jimmy Carter and Pat Darien. So, we didn't even talk about China. Basically, he and Deng Xiaoping established the global economy between them in 1979. China had the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa at that time. And, so the normalization of relations, Carter believes, is the most impactful thing he did in his presidency. And the list goes on from there. But I have to say, in many ways, I was equally intrigued by his trying to deal with this white terrorism in his own backyard in the 50s and 60s. And it was just so much more vicious than I realized. You know, cattle prods on 14-year-olds by the sheriff who, when Andy Young, who blurbed my book, when he first met Carter, he said, "Oh, you're from Sumter County. Do you know Sheriff Chappell?" And Carter said, "Yeah, he's a friend of mine." And Andy Young said, "Well, Dr. King called him the meanest man in the world." So Andy Young was a little skeptical at first. Now he loves Carter. But, you know, there's this whole history in Georgia that is, I cut 100,000 words out of the book, and I really wish it had been 2 volumes, because the complexity of the politics in Georgia in the 50s and 60s and 70s just fascinated me.
And see, we have a few more questions. Larry Berman, who taught us all PS 106 at UC Davis. So, is Larry still, did we lose him? There he is, you're mute. There
Okay, yeah.
And Johnson scholar that he is, Lyndon Johnson scholar.
I thought you were reading my notes a little while ago, but from 40 years ago. Here's Jonathan, this was really terrific. I'm on sabbatical this year, but next year I'm teaching an honors seminar in the Carter Library, in which the students will be required to use all of the archives there, and I'll be writing on 15 or 20 different subjects. Most of them will come out of this, and we're going to use your book. So just, I'm going to ask you to come and speak to the students too, I'm excited. So my question actually is about Rickover. I spoke to this club. I did a book on Zumwalt. So, I mean, I know the Zumwalt Rickover.
I used your book. I don't know if it's in the bibliography, but I saw it because I was very interested in the Zumwalt Rickover, Zumwalt Hidden.
Oh, yeah, right. So what I'm interested in, I lived only a mile from the Carter Library for 8 years, and I never got a chance to do this. And I'm curious to know if you looked into this, which was Rickover's influence on Carter during his presidency. Did they consult? Was this was there a back channel? Just be curious if you could talk about that.
Yeah, there was. Unfortunately, I cut a lot of that out when I was cutting 100,000 words. But yeah, so one thing that I do have in there is he comes to visit Carter like 2 months after he's sworn in, and Carter hasn't seen him since he left him, and Rickover was really ticked off that Carter left the Navy when his father died, left this super elite program. And he had talked to him on the phone when he was governor about an education bill that Rickover is very important in establishing the higher ed system that we have now. And Carter told the story, and then I got it from somebody else who was there. Actually, I think it was Rafshun was there that day, that Carter stood as if he was at attention when Rickover came in. And he was the most nervous that any of his people had ever seen him in the moments before Rickover came into the office to see them. That was the beginning of a pretty substantial relationship they had. And that day, Carter writes in his journal that Rickover tells him, "Well, you'll probably lose when you run for re-election, but you can make a comeback in 1984. It's like, what? He's only been president for 2 months, and Rickover's telling him, "You'll probably lose." Then Carter went out on the USS Los Angeles, a nuclear-powered submarine, and spent the whole day with him. It was the first time he'd ever been on a nuclear submarine because he had left the Navy before the prototype that he was working on was actually built. And Carter was so happy. He loved everything about it. Then they went to the Rickovers for dinner, and Rickover took a liking to Amy and gave her presents. And you saw kind of the softer side of Rickover. And then after 3 Mile Island, he consulted extensively with Rickover. And Rickover, he had him do a report after 3 Mile Island about the nuclear industry in the United States. But he would not let Rickover lobby him. You know, he could tell him a little bit, but he wasn't, he was really, the guy has a lot of integrity. You have to, he exaggerates some, you know, and, you know, he's definitely a politician in many respects, but you really couldn't cut many corners with him. And there were many examples of that, where normal things that you would do in politics, he just wouldn't do. Sometimes they were done without his knowledge. And I have several examples of that. And, the Rickover story absolutely fascinated me. I have a whole chapter on his time in the nuclear Navy. At one point, there's a meltdown at an experimental nuclear reactor in Canada, in Ontario, Canada, a place called Chalk River, secret reactor. This was the first disaster of the nuclear age in 1952. And there's an all points bulletin that's put out by the Canadian authorities, highly classified. And Rickover sends Carter on a small team to Canada, and it's determined that they can only go in the reactor for 90 seconds without dying. And they were very worried about what that 90 seconds would do. And they trained on a tennis court near the reactor, which was all flooded out with radioactive water. And I dug up a lot of old Canadian documents on this. Carter, you know, went in for the 90 seconds and turned this valve and that valve, and they made jokes about whether they would, you know, get cancer or be impotent or whatever they thought in those days might happen. And they actually got 1,000 times more rads than the experts thought at the time. But, you know, he had Amy 15 years later. Anyway, but that Rickover time was so central to him. And it also, as his former daughter-in-law said, it also made him into too much of a disciplinarian. You know, he would whip his boys, his three sons, not Amy, his three sons who were much older. And a lot of that kind of super hard-ass Jimmy Carter, which he now regrets, and I discussed with him at some length, he treated people, he wasn't a complete asshole like Rickover was, like Zumwalt rightly thought Rickover was, but he had a little bit of Admiral Rickover in him, and that did not do wonders for his personal relationships.
Okay, so let's see what we have here. So, Tony, you have your hand up. You get the last question, but you're on mute. I think we lost him.
I wanted to know if you had any, if you saw any connection between what Carter and Kennedy had with Clinton and Sanders had in this last election, with Sanders going the whole route to the convention and having Sanders help make Clinton lose the election because of his lack of wanting to bow out before the end of the election and having the same problem.
Jonathan, you're on mute.
What do I have to do to get? Okay,
you're fine. You're fine.
Okay, so sorry, there was some direction on the screen. I wasn't sure what to do. So the whole Carter family was for Bernie in 2016. And there's a lot of bad blood, as I mentioned, between the Carters and the Clintons. I don't think that Carter got involved more directly in trying to undermine Clinton. You know, he's not really very involved in domestic politics, so I don't think you can necessarily blame that one on him. But it was known in the Democratic Party that he didn't like the Clintons.
And with that, I think we should probably wrap it up. One thing before I do go, I just as a, I think is Larry still on the call? Yes, he took off. I think one of the conversations that we had, Jonathan, was about General Twin, and you had in the Pham Sunam thing. You said, oh, he's back. Larry had written a book on Pham Sunam, who was a triple spy in South Vietnam. I think you had known, I think, General Twin at one point. I think he was kind of the South Vietnamese version of J. Edgar Hoover or something to that effect. I'll make sure Larry gets a copy of the book off to you. And so here's what's coming up, gang. It's a lot of fun today. Next week, we have Bart Gellman. And Bart's joined us on several occasions. He's a lot of fun. Then we have the election panel. Then we've got John Callis, who's going to tell us where Mars is going. We've got Alicia Ostrander, poet laureate of the great state of New York. And then we'll probably start off with, as we always do, with Mike Dukakis, who will rejoin the Luncheon Society, this time not in Los Angeles, not in Boston, not in the great city of San Francisco, right here online. So thank you very much, Jonathan. It was great.
Before we go, Mr. Alter, this has been such a fascinating lunch. I'm a Carter guy going back to 78, but I love this book. If you haven't read it, you have to read it. It's a great book on Franklin Roosevelt in the 1932 election, and it even talks about William Gibbs McAdoo, who was a failed senator from California. He was a Klansman. How he got to California, it's crazy. But thank you so much. I really appreciated this.
Thanks. That book is
been guys. Thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun. And
thanks.
With that, John, I'll let you back to your day. You're no longer a hostage.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Jonathan, thanks a lot. Well, gang, it was fun. Paul, it's good to see you. I had forgotten that you were with Rosalind, and you were on her staff.
Yeah, 4 years at the White House. Okay. I was having PTSD hearing Jonathan talk about the 4 years.
Well, I think the steamy love letters, that certainly makes them
I've never seen the steamy love. I've seen the diary from Camp David, but I've never seen that. You know, and interesting, he didn't talk about the bad blood between the Carters and the Obamas too. The Obamas.
I don't know. Is that one of the things that you would think?
Obama was terrible to Carter. Carter has had better relationships with Republican presidents than with Democratic presidents. Obama would never return his phone calls. Inexplicable.
Well, I think some of it is they thought they couldn't depend on him in a way that sometimes ex-presidents send other ex-presidents on missions or something to do. And the way I understood it from one is that they didn't trust Carter, always had his own agenda in their opinion, and that he would not adhere to what their strategy or their mission would be, and they couldn't trust him to go do their bidding, basically.
I think trust, I would take exception with the word trust, but I do think that Carter had his own agenda wherever he traveled around the world. He had the Carter Center. He had very firm feelings about it. But what I never understood was why Carter would come back from a foreign trip, wherever he would go around the world, talking to leaders. Obama would never call him back when Carter called to give him a brief, to give him a debrief on it, to say, here's what I've just been in the Middle East, I've just been in China, I've just been wherever, here's what I saw, here's what, never. And Clinton, we know the relationships were terrible, and they started with when the Ariel Cuban, the Cuban refugees were sent to Little Rock area. I think that was one of the reasons why Bill Clinton lost his reelection, was the Mariel refugees, and that bad blood started and never left. Obama's, I still don't understand in this day. I don't get it.
I did hear Clinton talk about that Obama would never, ever trust. The way he put it to me, he said this to me, is he said when Clinton went to North Korea to get the journalist out. And I asked him about that trip, and he said, well, they're never he would never trust Jimmy Carter to do anything because Jimmy Carter would have his own agenda. And he said, I, went and had my marching orders and did what I was told. And he said, and in fact, when I was on that trip, the leader of North Korea tried to get me to discuss American policy with him. And he said, I just looked at him and said, I'm no longer president. You'll have to be talking to Barack Obama about that. And Bill Clinton said, I guarantee you Obama would not have trusted Carter with that mission for that very reason. He would have his own agenda, and he couldn't depend on him carrying the banner of the Obama administration.
And what's more, when Jimmy Carter sent a note to the UN general at the time of the first Gulf War, basically undercutting George H.W. Bush, which I think, whoa, I mean, you may not like it, but again, when, it reminds me of the story that when Douglas left the court, when William L. Douglas left the court, he wanted to come back as a 10th chair at some point. And finally, the Chief Justice had to say, no, you're done. You're retired. Go enjoy it. Hey, gang, I got to go.
Take care. Thank you.
Hey.
Bob, thanks. Another good one, Bob.
I think we'll be doing this. I'm sitting here in my house. I'm barefoot. I'm wearing shorts. I like it. Bye, honey.
Bye. See you soon.